environment in Central Asia. And we have a very good panel here. Our first speaker is Togzhan Kassenova, the Center for Policy Research, University of Albany. Togzhan, take it away. Yep.
Hello everyone, and welcome back from lunch. I'm really pleased to be here. I love GW, the program, but also the Allan School, and I used to teach here as an adjunct, so I have very warm feelings towards the school. So in my 15 minutes, I'll try to give a brief overview of Kazakhstan's discourse on potential nuclear power introduction to Kazakhstan's energy mix. And before I go into the pros and cons of the introduction of nuclear power, I really need to spend a few minutes on the past of Kazakhstan and how the nuclear theme reverberates in the popular psyche. And that's because for 40 years, since 1949 to 1989, the Soviet military tested more than 450 nuclear devices in Kazakhstan. There were also additional so-called peaceful nuclear tests. Most of those weapons-related tests took place at the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site in eastern Kazakhstan, with tremendous harm inflicted on the people, but also on the environment. Locals developed severe illnesses, including cancer, physical disabilities, children were born without limbs, and all sorts of extreme health damage has been inflicted. And it especially had an impact on women and children. So many stillbirths, physical deformities, Down syndrome, and so on. 3 decades later, from the last Soviet nuclear tests, the population in that region is still paying the price. So now we're talking about the 4th and the 5th generation of survivors of Soviet nuclear tests. I go regularly to the rural settlements near the former testing site, and it's incredibly difficult and heartbreaking to see little children with medical histories thick like this, on which there is formal acknowledge that the reason for their health issues is ionizing radiation, and the health impact is visible, so it's something that even non-expert people can see with their own eyes. And you go to one family, there is a child with 6 fingers, and you go to another family and the girl is missing 4 fingers. So I'm just trying to create this context in order to understand what's happening now and why the trauma is so severe and why it impacts the current discourse. So fast forward to today, and the government of Kazakhstan tried on several occasions to introduce nuclear power, but due to very strong public opposition, it couldn't go ahead with its plans, and now it seems that they will be able to do it. And so the government, of course, has good reasons and good arguments why Kazakhstan needs nuclear power. And those reasons include strengthening energy security, utilizing nuclear fuel production capabilities in Kazakhstan, stimulating the nuclear technology sector, as well as decarbonization and achieving green economy goals. And so I want to do something of a kind of reality check, but this is my subjective opinion as somebody who works on nuclear policy issues. So if we look at the energy deficit, it's true Kazakhstan has a real problem, and it already has a serious energy deficit, and it's very likely that it will grow. In 2023, Kazakhstan imported 14% of all its electricity needs, and Russia is the leading export of electricity to Kazakhstan. The existing thermal power plants are quite old and worn out, and energy deficit is a severe problem that needs to be addressed, and nuclear energy can provide a good, addition to the energy matrix as a stable source of electricity generation. But it should be noted that, building a nuclear power plant will take at least a decade, so it won't resolve any of Kazakhstan's immediate energy problems. But supporters of and proponents of nuclear power, they argue that that the benefits of nuclear power will go beyond just meeting energy needs, that it will really help also Kazakhstan's nuclear technology development, including in such a vital field as the production of medical radioisotopes, the isotopes we need to treat cancer and so on. Kazakhstan has a very well-developed nuclear industry. It's the world's largest uranium producer and has the world's second largest uranium reserves. Kazakhstan's national nuclear company, Kazatomprom, is one of the leaders on the international commercial market, and Kazakhstan has several stages of nuclear fuel production within Kazakhstan. Not all of them, but very important stages. So in a way, it does seem logical that you would want to utilize what already exists and push the nuclear industry even further. But the important caveat here is that Kazakhstan doesn't have a full nuclear fuel cycle because it depends on Russia for enrichment of uranium. The question of whether Kazakhstan has enough expertise and personnel. So the proponents would say we have enough of expertise, enough of personnel, because we already have 3 nuclear research reactors, and in the past, Kazakhstan had a fast breeder reactor in Aktau. Again, it's true on the one hand that there are many good technical specialists and there is some very important expertise present, but definitely not enough people to staff a full-on nuclear power plant, especially if eventually there will be 2 of them. This is, of course, a solvable problem if the government starts investing now in education and training a new generation of experts. Another important argument that the government is promoting is that Kazakhstan needs to fulfill its international environmental obligations and decarbonization goals. Again, there is some, it sounds like a very legitimate goal because approximately 70% of electricity in Kazakhstan is generated by air-polluting coal-powered plants, and so reducing reliance on coal would of course be helpful for the environment. But what we notice in our field is that usually nuclear energy is described as a clean source of energy, which is of course true if you compare a coal plant and a nuclear power plant. But you do need to integrate the environmental cost of constructing a nuclear power plant and also everything that is happening at the end, right? The issues of waste and all of that. Not a single country in the world solved the issue of the permanent disposal of nuclear waste. So that's where there is more nuance than is sometimes promoted. So the opposition to the introduction of nuclear power in Kazakhstan rests on concerns about nuclear accidents, the environmental impact, issues with financing, corruption risks, and the belief that the country has underutilized renewables and gas-generated energy capacity. And then there is a very distinct and very strong concern about geopolitical risks, primarily because everybody suspects that Kazakhstan would choose Russia, and there are obvious risks that are connected with this choice. So, let's again do a kind of a reality check and go through these arguments. Kazakhstan's population is very traumatized by the Soviet nuclear tests, and so this is something that is very strong. And I think these are legitimate fears, and they should be respected. When it comes to previous nuclear accidents, it's interesting how the 3 Mile accident in the United States doesn't feature in the discourse within Kazakhstan. But Chernobyl and Fukushima are very much present. I think Chernobyl especially had a very strong impact on Kazakhstan society. Many people, thousands of people from Kazakhstan were so-called liquidators. They were sent to Chernobyl. And so there is this very acute awareness of what happened in Chernobyl. Here, again, I need to add nuance. So we cannot really compare on equal terms Chernobyl, Fukushima, and current situation because the nuclear reactor technology really advanced. So these are not similar reactor technologies, and current reactor technologies are more advanced, and they have certain safety features that were not present in the past, but of course the risks are never zero. Another reason for concern is the site, because the government wants to build the first nuclear power plant next to the lake of Balkhash. That is of tremendous environmental value for Kazakhstan. It already has issues with, previously being abundant in fish, and now due to water issues, and decreased flow from the Ili River and climate change, there are already negative impacts on the fish population, for example. But in addition to these very legitimate fears, there is also some, I really don't like this word, radiophobia, but I don't know how differently to explain. But basically at the public level, there is often this conflation. And for example, within Kazakhstan, there is no distinction between the military nuclear technology and nuclear technology for peaceful use. So the discourse on nuclear power plants is very much attached to the military nuclear program. And again, it's the trauma of the Soviet nuclear test, but also I think just in general there is not enough awareness of what peaceful nuclear technology, what benefits there are and how helpful it can be if used properly. There are, of course, concerns about financing, and the government is saying it will cost 10 to 12 billion in US dollars. They recently said, no, but national budget funds will be used for it, and that's why Russian option is so attractive, and they're talking about different options, but just in general, the first question is where will the money come from, and the second is that any large-scale project opens up a lot of space for corruption, and unfortunately Kazakhstan is very vulnerable to corruption. And with the nuclear project, the risks are even higher because, right, if you use inferior material or if you don't meet the standards because for corruption reasons, the risks are on another level. I do want to use a couple of minutes on the Russia factor. So it's interesting that some people are opposed to nuclear power just in general for the reasons I outlined, but there is a category within Kazakhstan who are not opposed to nuclear power, but they're very much opposed to Russia being chosen as a supplier of a nuclear power plant. And there are very good reasons for that. I'm of it myself, and here I'm speaking for myself. I think it would be, it's such a serious, important choice, and there are so many factors that are working against choosing Russia at the moment. But first, let's start why Russia is attractive. Russia, there is, of course, the background, and technical specialists know each other, the same language. Russia is really offering the most attractive conditions to its future clients in terms of financing, taking back spent fuel, and so on. But I do think that, in the current situation, when Russian military is occupying a civilian nuclear facility of another sovereign state, Zaporozhye, when some of Rosatom's subsidiaries are under sanctions, I think it's just not a good moment to make such a choice. But of course, a lot of people in Kazakhstan think that the government will choose Russia for that project.
Togzhan,
yeah.
can you wrap up? About a minute left.
So I'll use my minute just to say that there were public hearings before the national referendum where the Kazakhstan should go ahead with the nuclear power plant, and the official data showed 71% in support. There were some preliminary polls, and including those done by independent organizations who I trust, and they also showed not 70%, but more than 50%. I have my theories why it probably was possible, because anecdotal evidence, at least when I'm in Kazakhstan, I rarely read or see comments that are very supportive of the nuclear power plant. I can go into details of why I think it's happening. But basically, I think the choice of Kazakhstan's government, it's an important choice, and eventually I think Kazakhstan would need nuclear power, but I just hope this decision is not rushed and serious questions are answered before the government proceeds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is my old friend Kate Waters from Crude Accountability. Please go ahead, Kate.
Okay, we have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to stand. Hello, everybody. Very, very happy to be here, and thanks so much to Sebastian and to all the organizers for the opportunity to be here. And it's an honor to follow you on the panel as well. So,
Can you use the mic?
yeah,
Or recording?
yes, sorry. Is that better? There we go. Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk today about extractive industries and sustainability in Central Asia, looking to the future, following on the presentation about nuclear energy. And I'm going to look specifically at the impacts of fossil fuels on the climate. There's so many angles that are possible in this kind of a discussion, but I'm going to look specifically at when we talk about the future and we talk about fossil fuels, what does that mean? And the biggest impact that we're seeing, or one of the big impacts we're seeing right now, particularly in Central Asia, is the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on climate and the impact on climate change. So I'm going to look specifically at Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. I know that's not all of Central Asia, but those are the main oil-producing countries, and so that's what my remarks are going to focus on today. And I want to focus, to start, I want to look at sort of two sort of big points that I think are important to consider. And one of those, oops, just lost the screen. Oh, you have one over there? Okay. One of those is looking at the commitments that both Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan have made with regard to climate negotiations, including the global methane pledge. And it's very important to underscore that both Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan have signed on to the global methane pledge, which is significant. And they signed on before other countries in the region, including Azerbaijan, which was the host of COP29 this past year, you may know. And part of what that means is that methane emissions will be reduced by 2030 by 30% of the current emissions data. The second is that there have been significant bilateral negotiations and also I would call assistance programs that have been going on in both Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, including with the US government, specifically focusing on methane emissions. Not only, but that's a big chunk of it. And so I think we have to ask the question sitting in here in Washington today, what is going to be the impact of that given sort of the situation with our government and the kind of the crushing of a lot of foreign assistance in the Central Asia region. So I apologize, there's going to be some of these sort of wonky charts that I'm going to put up for you. You don't need to look at all of them, but the point of this chart here is I want us to look at greenhouse gases by sector, right? Because you could argue, well, CO2 and NO2, for example, a lot of that could be coming from agriculture, right? But if we look at this sort of rust-colored section for both countries, for Kazakhstan and for Turkmenistan, that big rust color is fossil fuels and fugitive emissions specifically, fugitive emissions. And these data go up through 2021. This is a lot of data that I got off of this fabulous site called Our World in Data. I'll be showing you some more contemporary information in a couple of minutes, but just to kind of give you a trend, this shows from 2020 to through 2021. And you can see that fugitive emissions are a huge part of what greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. And if we look at what those gases are, and we look at them in Kazakhstan and we look at them in Turkmenistan, the red on that chart is carbon dioxide. The blue is methane. So take a peek at Turkmenistan, right? You may know that Turkmenistan is responsible for some of the biggest sort of super leaks of methane in the world. Of the last 100-some super emitter events, over 80 of them came from Turkmenistan. So this is a very large section, and then NO2 is the rust color up at the top. So just to give a little context, this is not all coming from people's cows, which is something that I've heard in some of the campaigning work that I've done in Western Kazakhstan, where the oil companies want you to believe that the emissions are just coming from people's farms, but they're not. If you look at methane emissions by sector in Kazakhstan, again, you can see that fugitive emissions is way above agriculture, which is the next one. And then just going to zoom through these. And then if we look at Turkmenistan, fugitive emissions are far and away the highest producer of methane for Turkmenistan for the reasons that I listed earlier. And then if we look at per capita, and I'll just remind you that both of these countries are countries with relatively small populations. Again, in Kazakhstan, electricity and heat is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. We heard a little bit about that earlier, but also fugitive emissions is coming in second. And if we look at Turkmenistan, with a very small population, fugitive emissions are far and away, per capita, the highest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can then look at methane. This is, I think, my last kind of super wonky slide. We've got methane emissions by sector in Kazakhstan. Again, fugitive emissions, far and away, highest source, and again, the same in Turkmenistan. So I think we can safely say that we've got an issue here with greenhouse gas emissions. We've got an issue here with methane in particular, and the source for much of this is coming from fossil fuel sector, coming from the oil and gas facilities in the region. So what's been happening since 2022, 2021? Those slides. Crude Accountability has been involved in a project that I'm going to talk about a little bit now, where we've been looking at emissions from fossil fuel facilities in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, looking at methane specifically, but also at other greenhouse gas emissions, other emissions that are coming from fields. And we've chosen 2 sites in Kazakhstan and 2 sites in Turkmenistan. And these are just very, very preliminary results that I'm showing you today. We haven't published anything on this yet. Y'all are seeing the first. But we've been working with a group based in the UK called Omanos Analytics, which is a satellite imagery company that works with human rights and environmental organizations to try and identify emissions, among other things. They've also helped us do things like identify expansion of a prison in Turkmenistan, so they can do all kinds of things. But we identified these sites as very important because we wanted to understand, particularly given the climate promises and the climate pledges that Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan have made. So what sort of progress are they making? We chose just a little bit about the sites. We chose Tengiz because obviously it's a massive site. It's got some of the world's largest and most forward-looking, at least in terms of technology companies. Chevron is, you may know, is one of the big shareholders at Tengiz. And then we looked at Togzhan, which is a smaller field in Kazakhstan, where we have done a lot of campaigning with our partners in Kazakhstan, and which sits on top of an aquifer, a water aquifer that has the potential to supply drinking water to millions and millions of people in Kazakhstan. The local community, local activists, international activists, including Crude Accountability, filed petition and a complaint both to the company and to the government of Kazakhstan about what was happening at Togzhan. And the government of Kazakhstan amazingly decided that they were going to decommission over 300 wells at the Togzhan field because of the risk to the water supply underneath them. So we're monitoring to see whether or not they're actually decommissioning those wells and whether they're doing that on schedule. They appear so far to be slightly behind schedule, but they are decommissioning. And the other part of the monitoring work that we're doing is actually looking at the through satellites at the gas flaring events. So this is just a sort of a snapshot of gas flaring at Tengiz and at the Togzhan fields in 2024. You can see, I'm not going to super wonk out on you here, but you can see the level of heat of the flares, and you can see that they are consistent and that they are around, they're around the field. As you may know, Tengiz is a massive field, it's huge, right? So these are not to scale with each other, but there are also numerous areas around the aquifer where you can see that flaring is taking place. So this is an ongoing issue. When we look in Turkmenistan, we looked at two fields there as well. One is the Burin field, which is close to the Caspian Sea, operated by ENI and others, and then the picture on the right is Galkanish, which is a natural gas field, so it's a little bit of apples and oranges here, but these are two significant onshore fields, and you can see that we've got hot gas flaring in both of those sites as well, ongoing. And when you look at, I'm sure you all have seen some of the articles, or maybe you haven't, some of the articles that were published about the super emitter events in Turkmenistan in particular, and you see these huge, they look like big plumes that take up massive amounts of space, and they're coming from these sites. So the conclusion is that the flaring is still continuing, right? And so what do we do? When we look at how the international climate community is sort of looking at Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, Climate Action Tracker, which is an international organization that looks at climate goals, has labeled Kazakhstan as insufficient in its efforts to meet its climate goals. To be fair, the US is also insufficient, massively insufficient in reaching its climate goals. There's no data for Turkmenistan. And this is one of the really important and interesting things about Turkmenistan, is that almost all data that does exist is not coming from the Turkmen government. It's coming from other sources that are tracking and following these pieces as best they can. And I can tell you from our own project, it isn't easy to find this stuff, and that's part of why we haven't published anything yet. But we're trying to be really, really careful to make sure that we're not screwing up, we've got it right. And then when we look at energy consumption, we know that 54% of domestic energy consumption in Kazakhstan is coming from oil, followed by coal and natural gas. There are stories that coal consumption in Kazakhstan is going up and up and up. It has a lot to do with Chinese investment, but not only. And renewables are about almost 12% of electricity generation in Kazakhstan. That's again 2022 figures. So we don't have the most up-to-date, the most current figures. And then not surprisingly, in Turkmenistan, 89% of domestic energy consumption comes from natural gas, and the rest of it comes from oil. There's essentially nothing coming from renewables, at least not as of 2022. To be fair, we know that there are projects that are ongoing. We know that the government of Turkmenistan is working with the United States, with the UNDP, with others to try and reduce its methane, specifically its methane emissions. But there is a very, very long way to go. And when we see that there has been sort of a continuous expansion of the major oil and gas fields in the region, Tengiz has just undergone an expansion. Karachaganak has just undergone a massive expansion. There are big expansions going on in the southern part of the Caspian Sea. These all involve the major Western oil majors. And we also have seen simultaneously big oil pivoting away from a lot of its promises around renewables. I think it's fair to say that in the short to medium term, we're probably looking at a continuation of a massive part or a significant part of energy consumption, energy use coming from the fossil fuel sector in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and probably much of the world. And that's not a good story when we look at our climate. So the question is whether renewables, whether green energy can develop at a rate that can sort of be at least running parallel alongside all that other development, so that eventually wind energy, solar energy, and there are massive investments in those types of projects as well, particularly in Kazakhstan, but the numbers, they're just not comparable. But if that technology and that process can continue, maybe we can have a possibility in the future. We know the technology exists. We know the possibility is there. It's really a question of political will. And what I think is in some ways very similar to what we were hearing about nuclear is that the public wants what the public wants in some regards. I would also say, though, that there is a lot of damage, a lot of trauma also around the impacts of oil and gas on communities. And so all of that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Okay.
So I will stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. I know there are going to be some questions for you. Our final speaker in this panel is Vadim Ni, Environmental Challenges of the Caspian Sea.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Can you make it a slideshow?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the environmental challenges of the Caspian Sea. Due to the growing environmental crisis, these issues are of great concern for Kazakhstan and the region, including Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Russia. The sea is shrinking, anthropogenic impacts are increasing. I would use an example that even on two major oil fields, there are plans to expand the oil operations, namely on the Kashagan and Tengiz oil fields, which will increase the oil production by approximately for 15%, only on two oil fields. And so you see that more and more bets are put on the natural resources of the Caspian Sea, because the expansion of oil operations requires to also to deal with the dredging in seaports, but also probably on the sea. And then there are also plans by European Union with green hydrogen, for which they are also interested to use the water and to launch that project on the Caspian seashore of Kazakhstan near the city of Aktau. That is why at the end of last year I launched the Save the Caspian campaign, which is now a fast-growing movement in Kazakhstan. And before, in the last year, by the way, I coordinated the campaign against the nuclear power plant mentioned by Togzhan Kassenova. And this year, because colleagues told me to deal with the Caspian issues, including Kate, who to also here with us. I will begin my presentation by mentioning that His Excellency William Courtney, who was a keynote speaker at the first panel, was once the first US ambassador to Kazakhstan. He spoke about some of the challenges the Caspian region faced back in the 1990s, including what there will be covered by one of my slides. I must say that he was very open about the challenges we will face in the future. Some of the challenges are a result of our oversights, which can be explained by the lack of experience and knowledge. Of course, the mistakes of the past are not excuse for inaction in the present, but they are served for us as reminders why we need to take more responsibility today. I will use the 1995 as a starting point because at that time the level of the Caspian Sea was considered high for the Soviet period in Kazakhstan's history. Since the 1930s, the Caspian Sea level has been fallen and reached its minimum in 1997. And then after that, it started rising again and reached its maximum in 1995. But since then, the sea level has been only decreasing and is now below the record minimum of 1997. On the slide, you can see the data related to the difference in the sea level and the sea surface area. The current drop in the level of the Caspian Sea is associated with the climate change and the changes in the flow of rivers feeding the Caspian Sea, including the Volga River, which river flow amounted almost to 85% of the total river flow to the Caspian Sea. It's not anymore the same situation with Volga River. The northern part of the sea covering the coast of Kazakhstan is the most vulnerable because it's the shortest part of the sea. That is why we have no choice but to take the responsibility and some state even leadership and call on public authorities to assume the lead on this issue. Next slide, I will show that many people believe that Caspian Sea fluctuations are cyclical in nature, and that the period of sea level fall will be followed by a period of rise. However, we should keep in mind that temperatures rise and the water demand of the economy and population are also increases, and so does the rate of water evaporation. The projected level of water decrease in the Caspian Sea could range from 9 to 21 meters by the end of the century under medium and high greenhouse gas emission scenarios. Even under scenarios of low and medium greenhouse gas emissions, which lead to 5 and 10-meter drop in the Caspian Sea level, the northern part of the sea and the key ecosystems will be lost, and the 18 meters decrease scenario would lead to the loss of 40% of the sea, the current sea water surface. Climate skeptics would probably want to bring the shortcomings of the climate modeling as a counter-argument. However, we must then remember another one of its flaws. The climate modeling often does not account for population growth and water demand. This means that in the case of water bodies, even the most stringent climate change projections have a very high probability of coming true in terms of consequences. And then my next slide is about the situation with oil operations. The beginning of commercial oil production history is often associated with the Caspian region. However, this concerns at the beginning of the historical perspective, the Absheron Peninsula, where most of the Azerbaijani population now lives. Kazakhstan began to be seen as an oil exporting country much later. In the late 1980s, my wife and I were studying in the chemistry department of Kazakhstan's leading university. Many of our adult colleagues at that time were skeptical about the export prospects of Kazakhstan's oil because it has a high sulfur content and was considered unsuitable for transport by oil pipelines. Later on, it's just a few years after that period of time, Western companies brought in technologies to purify oil from sulfur. And the first agreement on the Togzhan oil field was signed in early 1994 with the agreements on Karachaganak to other major oil fields, Karachaganak and Kashagan, followed in 1997. We know that those agreements contain detailed environmental requirements, but all three agreements were concluded on conditions of confidentiality, and to this day they remain hidden from the public. Meanwhile, in 1998, the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation, Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters was signed in the Danish city of Aarhus. Kazakhstan ratified it in 2000, and then in 2001, the Aarhus Convention came into force. The proponent of the oil fields agreements and the Aarhus Convention have done in exactly the opposite directions with regard to access to information, and that's why we're trying to finally address this problem. So let's talk about what was happening to the Caspian Sea during the period of sovereignty of Kazakhstan. It was in the past home to 90% of the world's sturgeon population. I remember that even in the second half of the 1980s, black caviar was caught by poachers in that region, and it was ridiculously cheap. I remember when I was served in the Soviet army in that region, an officer once traded a bucket of black caviar for two or three bottles of vodka. That's, however, the poaching in the Caspian Sea has been recognized as a significant issue, and since the early 1990s, the preservation of sturgeon population has become a serious challenge. And since the 2010s, a moratorium on commercial sturgeon fishing has been imposed by all Caspian countries, and unfortunately, the Caspian Sea ceased to be a supplier of sturgeon and black caviar now. Since the 2000s, periodic mass deaths of Caspian seals have become a serious concern for the local communities. In October and November last year, almost 2,000 dead seals corpses were found on the Caspian coast of the Kazakh coast of the Caspian Sea. The theories associated these deaths with episodic, which can be described as an outbreak of disease affecting animals, but it continued to be circulated, but local communities are not buying it. They believe that they are caused by pollution, another factor of anthropogenic impact. primarily, of course, oil production. And the my next slide about the framework convention for the protection of the marine environment of the Caspian Sea, the so-called Tehran Convention. Since the early 2000s, the Tehran Convention has been seen as a source of hope for addressing the region environmental challenges. All Caspian countries, including Azerbaijan, Iran, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Turkmenistan, are parties to it since 2006. Next year will mark 20 years since the convention entered into force. Although the Tehran Convention is a framework convention, 4 protocols have been adopted. 2 of them, one on the protection of marine pollution incidents, and the second one on the protection of the sea against pollution from the land-based sources, have been ratified by both 5 countries and have entered into force. However, the expectation related to the Tehran Convention have not been satisfied. The permanent secretariat of the convention has not been established, and its functions are being performed by UNEP sub-regional office based in Geneva. There are proposals by Kazakhstan to move the permanent secretariat to the Caspian region. The knowledge about the Tehran Convention and its protocol is still shared by few persons in each country, and the participation in the conferences of the parties, which held every 4 years, is very limited. To put it simply, we can just say that the implementation at the national level have not even yet started. And then
Vadim, could I interrupt for just a minute, please, Vadim?
Since December of last year, we, including Kate Waters and myself, have joined our forces in the Save the Caspian Sea movement. In a short period of time, we successfully launched an extensive public awareness campaign. Today, we are the main sources of information for publication on the Caspian Sea in Kazakhstani and regional media. We also managed to mobilize communities in the Caspian cities of Kazakhstan, Atyrau and Aktau. In mid-February, also filed a lawsuit to challenge the government for refusal to disclose the environmental terms of the Kashagan and Tengiz agreements. So far, the first and second instance courts ruled that I have no standing to appeal against the refusal to disclose the information from the agreements. So if my case doesn't get accepted by courts in Kazakhstan, I'm going to turn to the Aarhus Convention compliance mechanisms. So far we have already managed to initiate public consultation on the Caspian Sea crisis in the Parliament, which took place last week in Astana. We are also working actively with UNEP to reinvigorate the Tehran Convention. And based on my experience of several successful high-profile environmental campaigns in Kazakhstan, that's aside the last year campaign against the construction of the nuclear power plant, I'm optimistic about the future of the Save the Caspian Sea campaign. Thank you.
Three very good presentations. I thank our speakers, and I'll open the floor for questions. Question over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Saulia Akhmetova. I'm visitor scholar at George Washington University. I am from Kazakhstan. So I have been working for many years as a department chemical engineering and ecology. So my questions for Madam Kate Waters. What is, it's correct, my pronunciation? So it's clear, yeah, that non-renewable resources such as coal and gas and oil and so they are not the resources. These resources, raw material resources, are not are limited. So and not decrease the quantity, even quality of resources decrease. Yeah. So and from your presentation, because your presentation is the name, the crude accounting, yeah, and looking to the future. So what is the perspective from your accounting for, because sustainability development usually is accounted for near the nearest 50 years, no? So if I have not mistaken. So and what is your perspective for Kazakhstan maybe, because it's in your presentation there was positive some indicator for Kazakhstan that 11%, approximately 11% of raw materials are renewable. Then we use oil and coal and gas. So and there is no data on Turkmenistan because they use 89%. Yeah. So what is your crude or maybe more inaccurate perspective accounting for perspective for Kazakhstan? How will we develop our technology or for using renewable energy resources? It's a case. Sorry for my English. So, can you answer, please?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead and answer.
Great. Is the mic on? Yeah. Thank you very much for your question and for the work that you do. I mean, I think it's not an easy question to answer, right? I mean, there are whole groups of experts who are looking at this question, but I think the answer is that we need to bite the bullet, to mix my metaphors here, and stop investing in fossil fuels, right? We need to stop doing that, not just Kazakhstan, but everywhere. And it's tough, and it's going to be, it's difficult. But Kazakhstan is also, in some ways, a really good example. There is a very large solar investment that was made, funded in part by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where there's solar powered, solar energy, solar fuel coming from this big solar bank that the EBRD and others have invested in. From some of the ground truthing that we've done on that project and that our partners have done on that project, it is in fact a very clean project. There have been some questions, some human rights questions about relocation being done not in a proper way. But if we're looking at it from a climate perspective and looking at it from an energy perspective, that is a cleaner way to go forward. I think part of the problem right now in Kazakhstan, and not only in Kazakhstan, is that the engineering challenges around what Vadim was talking about, for example, cleaning the sulfur out of oil, or digging deeper, or finding a cooler way to make a fake island to pull oil out of the North Caspian, or whatever it is, those engineering challenges are winning out. They're expensive, they cost money, they're fun, they're challenging to the people who are doing them. And that is winning out in the balance against environmental health concerns, environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on the Caspian. All of that isn't being discussed, I don't think, in the same room. And what has to happen is a more comprehensive conversation about what is the true cost of what we are talking about here? What are the true costs of continuing down the fossil fuel road, as opposed to taking the hard choices and going the other way, and finding some way to kind of bridge between now and then. Because it's all about, we've got to think about not just the long term, but what's going to happen in the next 10 years. The world's on fire, and we need to do something about it now.
Thank you. But in general.
Vadim, you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just add to the answer provided by Kate, just with exact numbers. That on the Tengiz oil field, recently was the project on expansion of operations was past the EIA stage, and it's they are planning to increase the oil production by 10 million ton of oil per year, according to some plans on some other website, not the operator website, even 12 million ton. And then on Kashagan, it's 3 or 4 million ton. And then just to compare with the current production, in 2023, Kazakhstan produced the oil in the total amount of 90 million ton. So it's a significant increase. And we already in 2023, we exceeded the quota set by OPEC plus. And then it will engage additional emissions, not only methane, but CO2 emissions. And then why the study conducted by Crude Accountability is important? Because the methane emissions from oil fields, they are not covered normally by national inventories, because it's kind of leakage, yeah, that's which are not covered by the counting at the national level. So when we are saying that we're trying to do our best to reach the target set by national determined contributions, there are huge emissions which are not covered by accounting and the reporting system. That's why it's important to deal with the methane emissions, because normally we are calculating on the volume of the oil produced by a country, and then by using some factors we are calculating the relevant CO2 emissions, and that's what is the leakages are not covered.
Okay.
Thank
you for that comprehensive answer, Vadim.
I'm participating in promoting the new law on climate change. At least they will trying to have in place the transparency system to it, namely the inventory system for greenhouse gases, because they are not doing any. That's why Kate mentioned that there are no data for Turkmenistan on greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Ilira, let's go with you. You have the microphone.
Thank you very much. My question to Togzhan Kassenova regarding the trauma caused by during USSR during nuclear testings in Kazakhstan fields. We have artists from Kazakhstan who are married to Kyrgyz in Ocean. I interviewed her. She's a painter and she paints because her childhood trauma, because she lived in that village where they did testings and she has seen it, and now she's painting, and they go every year annual walk memorizing what happened to their ancestors, to them, to their kids. It's a huge trauma after Zhut, after hunger, I think, which has huge consequences. So are there any activism movements, like maybe journalistic investigations or artists who are trying to bring this to the public discussion, or any platforms discussing these consequences of this trauma and then how to counter it in the future?
Thank you very much for this question. So for the scale of trauma that was inflicted on Kazakhstan, the reflection and processing of this within Kazakhstan is still insufficient. And that's for many reasons, including the fact that I think partly Kazakhs, in their resilience, they shut down their past-traumatic experience and kind of march on, partly for political reasons that, until recently it wasn't a good subject to discuss, just in general, anything, that was bad that happened during the Soviet period. Even now I notice there is a lot of self-censorship and not everybody wants to go too deep into this. But over the last few years, I think there is this renewed interest and need, including from the younger people, those in their 20s who don't even, who never lived in the Soviet Union, but I think in their kind of process of, being interested in, what was the experience of the Soviet Union and reviewing the Soviet past and how it impacts the national identity and everything. I'm just so grateful to see there are young activists who are, nuclear disarmament activists, those who started working with the affected communities. And in art, we see it from sound installations to, there's been reflected in paintings, poems, theater. And I would love to talk with you offline and maybe send you some links because I would also be interested to hear about your friends. So I think there is this resurgence and this will be, I think, getting more and more attention. And arts and people from the arts, they're the ones who, to me, are, the ones who at the, they're in the front. They're in front of the society overall, and through art there is so much, I think, power, in telling the stories through art.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this presentation on the environmental issues that are at stake. I'd like to ask is how do you see, Kate and Togzhan, how do you see the role of the United States abandonment of anything now? And so much so we see a daily repeated advertisements by the energy commissions in the United States saying that it's all open up, everything's fair game, including coal. They don't say coal, but then Trump does say it's all on the table. So how do you see any progress being made anyplace else in the rest of the world when we have totally thrown out everything?
Kate, you want to start, and then Togzhan, you follow up?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think that the United States has an enormous responsibility for what has happened with regard to the environment in the Caspian Sea basin. Many of the major oil companies that are there, particularly when we talk about fossil fuels, but not only, but I'll just focus on fossil fuels. The major oil companies that are there are either American companies or they're big majors that have a significant presence in the United States, like BP, but Chevron, Exxon, all the major American corporations are there. And when Vadim was talking about those contracts that were made in the 90s, they were with companies like Chevron. So we bear an enormous responsibility for what is happening there. I think our foreign policy has always been a sort of dance between trade and business interests in the region on behalf of members of chambers of commerce in the United States, and then also human rights, democracy, and that basket, right? That's just been destroyed or is being destroyed right now in the State Department, DRL. So without that little bit of balance that was there before, I think that we're in a period right now of enormous concern with regard to environment, fossil fuels, corporate advance, Tengiz is growing, Karachaganak is growing, also a Chevron operation, Kashagan is growing. CPC pipeline that was mentioned earlier that is not sanctioned, Chevron's a major shareholder there too. So we have a huge role that we're playing there, and we need to acknowledge that. Secondly, shrinking civic space in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan specifically, also in Turkmenistan, across the sea in Azerbaijan, another middle corridor country, is killing, literally, the civil society and human rights activists, climate activists, environmentalists who are working on those issues. So we have some tough conversations to have as citizens, as civil society people, as academics, as whatever we are. We have some really hard internal looking to do right now about what our individual roles are going to be in the face of what's happening in our government.
Thank you. I would just add, to me, the impact is twofold. The first level is at the implementation on the ground, and that's through funding. That I know some NGOs who, for whom, even the freeze of the foreign assistance aid meant that they might, they wouldn't survive because they couldn't go for 3 months without paying salaries to the employees, for example. So the US funding that went into those NGOs that did this great work on environmental issues, that was, I think, the most immediate practical impact. But the second level to me is even more important, and that's the level of norms and values. Because, with all the issues that this country has, and it's now also in my country, still US was one of the main promoters of these very important values. And so when from within Washington you hear, very questionable statements about many things, and then they're picked up by critics within the countries who now can use it and say, oh look, even the White House is saying that USA projects were paying for God knows what. It's just so detrimental to this. It's more intangible, but more long-term, and I think very harmful. The only silver lining in this situation is that maybe it will push, for internal resilience and kind of, out of crisis come new opportunities, and, the civil society, hopefully within the region, will become even more self-reliant.
More questions?
And if it's possible, I will add this question. Just I will focus on the one step, the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. At the beginning, some of my colleagues, because I'm specializing on climate policy and law in Kazakhstan and Central Asia, people try to take it not seriously. As, oh, it was already during the first term, and then nothing serious will happen. I said, stop guys, this time is very serious, because I see that my expectation is that any regions or countries will take seriously the previously announced net zero strategies until 2050, 60, maybe Europe. But then for Europe it will be high cost to fulfill their pledge. That's why we are planning our activities now based on the assumptions that nobody is going to really follow the oil exit strategies. That's why it's the expansion, the current expansion of the operations on Tengiz oil fields and Kashagan, they are very serious. We are considering that it will happen. Not only in Kazakhstan, because we are not producing oil for Kazakhstan, we're producing for other countries, including Europe. And that's why we should, this whole climate policy is changing significantly just because of the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement.
We have a question back here.
So,
Get the microphone.
maybe it's not needed microphone, okay.
And thank you. I have just a comment that so a multifaceted conference and very different topics, and three last reporters have the most crucial problem in Kazakhstan. Nuclear industry, Tingish oil and Caspian Sea. So the poor Caspian Sea feeds 5 countries: is Kazakhstan, Russia, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Iran, and much emissions in for air pollution, and there are many problems in this area in Kazakhstan. And my groupmate, university groupmate, works in Tingish Road, and even she works in office. She has a problem in dermatological problem in her skin, the allergy and other problems, and all the people, workers, and population in this area have such problems. And according to the nuclear, it's a great problem. So there are many arguments in Kazakhstan according to the building of the IS atom plant. And according Caspian Sea, there are many problems, there are many arguments, and according to this issue. And totally, I should say that Kazakhstan needs professionals in ecology, and it is disaster in ecology, and we should save our air, and we should teach in universities, we should teach professionals in ecology, and we should improve to purify our air. So thank you.
So we have time for some more questions. One more question?
If it's possible, I'll just update on the nuclear power plant development in Kazakhstan. What we are hearing from our mass media and the statements by officials in Kazakhstan, currently it's likely that they do not have funding for nuclear power plants in Kazakhstan. They are not withdrawing from the plants, but we used to read between lines, and what we can read that there are no potential investors for the nuclear power plants in Kazakhstan. Russia was considered as the main potential investors of nuclear power plants in Kazakhstan, but more and more it looks for us that Russia has no funds available to construct nuclear power plants in Kazakhstan, because it will require 25 billion US dollars for as a minimum. So it's we do not think that Russia have such funds for this investment in Kazakhstan. So it's still unclear who will pay for the nuclear power plants in Kazakhstan. We have no such funds, and there is a clear message by the government: they are not going to use the oil palm assets for the construction of the nuclear power plants.
Could you all please give a full round of applause to all three of those speakers?